Welcome to the 18th anniversary of the JCC Rockland International Jewish Film Festival. I'm Mickey Leader, Chair Emeritus of the festival. We want to thank Orange Bank and Trust as the festival's overall sponsor, and sponsors of tonight's opening film Shared Legacies are the Chasen family, the Ben Moshe family, the Leader family, and Leader and Burkhan LLP. We thank you all for your support. So let's welcome tonight's panel. Dr. Shari Rogers, director of this incredibly timely documentary, the African-American Jewish film on civil rights. Dr. Shari Rogers is a clinical therapist and social activist whose work encompasses movie production, writing, educational programming, curriculum development, and public speaking. She is the president and founder of Spilled Honey, a Michigan organization committed to promoting human dignity as well as advancing public knowledge of the Holocaust and the civil rights movement. Dr. Rogers joins us tonight as the producer director of Shared Legacies. We're also honored to have our new U.S. Congressman from Westchester and Rockland, Mondaire Jones. The Congressman is serving his first term from the New York 17th District, encompassing all of Rockland County and parts of central and northern Westchester County. Representative Jones was raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to provide for their family. After graduating from Stanford University, Representative Jones worked in the U.S. Department of Civil Justice, U.S. Department of Justice Office of Legal Policy, where he vetted candidates for federal judgeships and worked to reform our criminal legal system to make it more fair and equitable. He later graduated from Harvard Law School. And our final panelist, Rabbi Isaiah Joseph Rothstein. He serves as rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor at Jewish Federations of North America. He grew up in a mixed race family in the ultra-Orthodox community of Muncie, New York. Isaiah most recently served as rabbi in residence at Hazan, the Jewish Lab for Sustainability. He is the co-founder of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement and Kamocha, a community for Black Orthodox Jews. Welcome. Dr. Rogers, I'm going to start with one or two questions with you, and then we'll move on to some questions with our congressman. What inspired you to make this film? In ways of when did you begin it and what were some of the issues you had to deal with?
Thank you for the question, and honored to be here with this esteemed panel. Just so thrilled. I'm from Michigan, and I happen to be at our Charles Wright Phenomenal African American Museum in Detroit, Michigan. And there was a professor from Stanford University, Dr. Clarence B. Jones, and he had at the time, many, many years ago, had just written a book called What Would Martin Say? And he had the right to write such a book because not only was Dr. Jones, Dr. King's legal advisor, but he was also his draft speech writer for many of his speeches, including the I Have a Dream speech. And one of the chapters that he had written about was on anti-Semitism, and he had been specifically talked about how Dr. King had asked him to remind people of the 24/7 commitment of the Jewish people to the struggle of the Blacks during the civil rights movement. As Dr. Jones tells me, Dr. King knew that his life was limited. He knew there was a tag on his life. So he would assign different tasks to different people within his circle.
This is both for the congressman and for the rabbi. Were you aware of all the history between the Black and Jewish communities, the coalition to fight for civil rights? Where did you learn about it? In school, college, or in your own communities, and when? Congressman, you could take the first answer.
Mickey, I love this question because one of the people who taught me this history was Clarence Jones. Shari doesn't know this, but when I was at Stanford University, I had the opportunity to help edit that book and to do research for it. and he thanks me in that actually. So what a funny coincidence, and what a beautiful coincidence that is. I studied under Clay Carson, who is perhaps the foremost historian, and he was a professor at Stanford University on the civil rights movement, and particularly the role that Dr. King played. But to be sure, I've been studying this issue since my involvement in the NAACP, which began in my freshman year of high school in the East Ramapo Central School District, and through that involvement, learned the history of that organization, learned that it was Henry Moskowitz that helped to co-found that organization in 1909, that it was Kivy Kaplan who would go on to later lead that organization as the president of the National NAACP. And of course, just further deepened my understanding through taking a series of courses in the African American Studies Department at Stanford, which taught me about people like Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner and James Chaney and their historic partnership and sacrifice during what was called the Freedom Summer in the year 1964, where Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner went to Mississippi to help register Black voters in particular, and join the Black activist James Chaney. And so much of what is in the film was beautiful to be reminded of, this sort of shared history, and I think linked fate of the Black and Jewish communities. And in fact, I wrote about that after the tragic murder in Muncie a few years ago, calling on the Black community to stand with the Jewish community, as our history really shows that we have.
Rabbi, would you like to answer that question also?
Sure. Thank you, Mickey. And Dr. Rogers, thank you so much for your commitment to this work, and also the reminder of education, right, and storytelling, and how important that is for our generation, and the gift, right, as we leave the holiday of Passover, the Seder night, retelling a story, holding a legacy, the gift of being able to know your story and being able to have that threaded, I think is just so powerful. So Congressman, really a pleasure to be here with you, an honor. Mickey, thank you. And I was born and raised in Rockland County in Muncie, New York, in Remsen. I went to Pomona Middle School for middle school, and I was raised in the ultra-Orthodox community. I was also raised mixed race. My mom is a Black convert to Judaism. So in terms of Black Jewish relations, it's kind of my life, I guess, like, both Black and Jewish. And then in terms of history, I would say both my parents, from our rich heritages, our dual identities, our ancestry, the legacies that we hold, they both instilled in me and my siblings like a very deep love of celebrating what it means to speak up, speak out, to be prophetic, to raise your voice, to speak out for justice and equity. My father, he was raised secular, and he became religious through Chabad, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And we know Chabad, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, he spoke about equity all day. He spoke about redemption, people having what they need. And my mom, she was raised, in Chicago, in the heart of the civil rights era. She's about 73 years old. And the stories that my uncles have told me, so I would say I've lived with it to a certain extent, but I've definitely revisited this narrative of the 20th century civil rights struggles, the 50s and the 60s this year. Also contextualizing, a lot of people, they're zoomed in on an issue. They're like, oh my gosh, 2020, the murder of George Floyd, but really, if there's context here, there's hundreds of years of context, and so in that way. Mark Dollinger's book, Black Power, Jewish Politics. That was a book that I read in the last year, which really kind of uncovers and tries to see some of the nuance, both of what Congressman was sharing before about the founders of the NAACP, but also conflict of interest, and also where the communities were aligned, where they weren't, and kind of seeing where things shifted. And Dr. Rogers, I'm sure you could say a lot more on this, but anyway, so that's kind of how I've come into this conversation of civil rights. And the last thing I'll just say is, my name is Isaiah Joseph, and my entire life, that was important, that my parents, my mother who named me, again, speaking for the sake of seeing a world when the knowledge of God will cover the world like the sea. You know, these ideas that nation will not lift up sword against nation. You know, and then this person of Joseph being a dreamer for more. I think those things also, like, it really connects me to living in this world, in our generation, seeing the needs, and how do we bring our faith to life. So
Thank you. I just want to move on to our next question that addresses the Congressman. I'm sure with all of your history, you know about the Black Jewish Caucus, but can you explain, in your view, how this film might be used by the caucus and the Congress?
You know, this is a caucus that was founded by the great John Lewis, the conscience of the Congress. And unfortunately, I was not able to serve with him concurrently. He left us before then, but I do remember the occasion of meeting him maybe in about 2012 or so, and telling him how inspired I was by his service and by his example. And I think this film can be used in furtherance of that relationship that was really rooted in, like I said earlier, a linked fate. So that sort of this common threat of white supremacy, which unfortunately is resurgent in the United States of America today, is one that, if nothing else, should be unifying to the Black and Jewish communities. And that was certainly true during the Civil Rights Movement. It certainly has been the case that in recent years, the same people who marched in Charlottesville against Black people were also marching against Jews. We've seen the burnings of both Black churches and synagogues in places throughout this country as part of that rise in white nationalist domestic terrorism. And it is incumbent upon both leaders in the Black and Jewish communities and Blacks and Jews themselves to unify in this moment and for all time moving forward, because we have so much more in common than divides us. And we know that when we come together, as our history, as this film shows, and I think can energize and help to inspire us to do, we can accomplish so much in the area of social justice and making sure that everybody in this country and indeed throughout the world, regardless of how they look, how they worship, and I will add who they love, it is able to live in dignity.
I'd like to also ask, I think first, if Dr. Rogers, you might give an answer to this question, and then move on to the Congressman and Isaiah, Rabbi Isaiah. Some of our Jewish prophets, like Isaiah and Amos, inspired Dr. Martin Luther King. What do you think is the relevance today with the Black Lives Matter movement? So Shari, if you want to give your thoughts about this, and then we can get to the Congressman and Isaiah, Rabbi Isaiah.
Well, I think when it comes to a prophet, I'm probably the least knowledgeable one on this one. However, I do know when I went to the New African American Museum, it says, "Let justice roll down like a mighty stream." And even on Dr. King's tombstone, I think there's a prophet that is mentioned there. And I think for the Jewish people, especially during the 60s, after the books were burned in Nazi Germany, especially many of the Jewish books, to have Dr. King lift up the prophets, the Jewish prophets, the Old Testament was such a gift, I think, to the Jewish people, and it meant a lot. And I think that these prophets continue to inspire many of the churches throughout the country. Ambassador Young always says that so much of the church teaching is Old Testament teaching. So it's almost shocking how much, how many stories really motivate our faith and the faith of the Black community.
Congressman, would you like to comment on this?
that quote is the one I had in mind from Amos. And the fact is, the movement for civil rights for Blacks and Jews and for any marginalized group in this nation is long-suffering work, and it remains unfinished. You know, we have seen, even as we have seen Black voters help to elect the first Jewish senator from the state of Georgia in American history, John Ossoff, we have seen the backlash from white supremacists who would disenfranchise those same voters through most recently passing this so-called SB 202. And indeed, we have seen the proliferation of attempts to disenfranchise largely communities of color, working people, and young people all throughout this country in 43 states, it turns out. And so the work is clearly unfinished, but it is unifying work, I would submit. And I hope to be, and certainly plan on being, a leader in that work, in the Congress, and through using my platform however I can to bring people together to defeat what is, I believe, the greatest threat to American democracy today, and that is white supremacy.
I'm going to come back to you, Rabbi, in a second, because the congressman brought me to one of my other questions. We feel the film can serve as a template for renewal of our Black and Jewish unity, but we also want to be able to inspire and include all of the communities of color, the Asian communities, the LGBTQ communities, and anyone who has been oppressed. And now we're looking at that oppression, as you just said, in 43 states. How do you think this could serve as a template? How would you use it, the film, in education, in the Congress, wherever? What are your ideas for that?
I think in addition to being a deeply inspirational film, it is instructive in showing what communities can do, what marginalized communities in particular can do when they come together and endeavor as a coalition for justice. That coalition, which of course is stronger the wider it is. So yes, in addition to the fact that the same people who hate Blacks and Jews also hate members of the AAPI community, as we've seen in recent weeks, also hate LGBTQ plus individuals, as we've seen over the years, and so on and so forth. It is also of practical necessity that efforts for civil rights and civil liberties and social justice writ large have the largest possible coalition in order to defeat this rising resurgent threat that we've been talking about.
Rabbi, would you like to also talk about the film as a template for renewal of both the Black and the Jewish communities and its unity, and including the other communities?
Yes, thank you, Mickey. I want to go back to something that the congressman shared about coalition and relationship. Sometimes there are barriers to building relationships and building trust. We say that these relationships, we move at the speed of trust, right? So first it's exposure, it's education. There's a process that we need to go through. And I think what's so powerful about the film, it reminds me of a saying from the rabbis, that study is great, Talmud Gadol, because it leads us to action. Shemevi l'dei ma'aseh. It leads through study. I can make informed choices through study. I'm able to assess kind of my approach or what's essential to me and my identity. And so I think the film is actually a critical tool, and really just in general, when we think about education, to lead us then to those coalition spaces, helping us find the ways that what our lane is, so to speak, or where we are holding, I think, in a conversation. And that ultimately leads to, I think, empowerment for all different kinds of people. I think that when we come to coalition spaces. And as Congressman shared about, the wider the coalition, the better, right? We are stronger inherently. The more diverse we are, the more the voices that we come together. And just again, going back to the film, that starts with a learning process.
I would also mention that in your position as Director of Public Policy for Federation, where do you see this being used as a template, or the film itself, in education and outreach? Do you see it in use with children, high school, colleges, joint federations, synagogues, churches, etc., broadening it out? Because we can
Yes.
talk about it, but we need action steps. So, and I know it's off the top of your head, but where would you start using this film as a template?
Thank you, Mickey. Working as a rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor at Jewish Federations of North America for the last year or so, the work that we do around education specifically is we have actually a curriculum that we're developing called the JEDI curriculum. JEDI stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And when trying to essentially say that there's a baseline of knowledge for the Jewish communal ecosystem to engage with around race, really we start with ourselves, with our own implicit biases. Again, there's an arc to learning. And I think, engaging in the public square is holy and sacred work. But if we're not aligned with our own selves, it becomes all the more murky, in an already very murky kind of, when it comes to intergroup relations. And so starting with ourselves, understanding the structures, as Congressman was saying, of what it means to live in a system and a structure and a society that's built off of hierarchies around race, where white is a category and there's a spectrum there of whiteness, as we also would see, different people acculturate or became white, right? And so there's, including, where do European Jews fit in this conversation? And there's a learning arc, that we suggest, exploring our Jewish and racial identities. But there are then those conversations that we engage with, again, going into our home, starting with our families. There's about 1 million Jewish people of color in America. And often, don't get me wrong, we need to make sure we're showing up in the civic space. But often we need to make sure that, in addition to starting with ourselves, that we're engaging with our communities. There might already be inequities. There might already be questions around how organizations respond to inclusivity and belonging more broadly. And then from there in our curriculum, our Unit 6 is Jews and Civil Rights, right? And thinking about how the 20th century civil rights movement is actually informing how we engage in the 21st century civil rights movement and civil struggles. And I think that ultimately, there's no question that film, all the more so with TikTok and all these other things, where just the visual with the audio, with the shifting, and Dr. Rogers, what you do so beautifully and capture, I think it's a critical tool for us to better assess, oh, wait, 21st century, we're catching up. Look at the shoulders we're standing on. Look at the legacy we hold. Not all, again and again, what that looks like when we come together. And I think once that Unit 6, our last unit, is really, what does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean to empower each other? What does it mean to literally be in relationship for the sake of relationship, not for just, don't get me wrong, it's good when there's a mutual agreement and there's some transactional pieces, but that the heart is there, that allyship is not. And so I think in that way, I found it very profound, the work that you're doing, Dr. Rogers, and critical to especially this moment where I think there's a reckoning, an awakening, a certain awareness. Like, we need quality educational tools. We really do.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, we have about 80 to 100 other hours that we couldn't use for the film, but because we're a nonprofit, we are organizing 5 to 7 minute videos with a stellar group of professors that will underscore the short videos that you can't tell you can't tell everything in a movie. So, you know, the movie's supposed to inspire, but you to really then go and learn, and all the nuances of starting early in the 1900s all the way up to 2021. But as Dr. Clarence B. Jones says, if the lions don't tell their stories, the hunter will get all the credits. And we feel honored that we were able to get so many of the lions. So for instance, when we interviewed Reverend C.T. Vivian, he said no one ever asked him about what he had witnessed with the Jewish people. He's, you know, obviously he had so much on his plate, and President Obama said he was one of the most important reverends that ever lived, but this wasn't at the forefront of what other people would had asked him. So we spent days with him. So I feel fortunate that we were able to get his personal recollections and witness to this history, including Congressman Lewis, which I'm sure a lot of people have interviewed him, but the fact that we were able to interview him so closely right before he passed away, we feel honored about this history in particular.
I want you to bring up another quote and to both address the Congressman and Rabbi Isaiah. Susanna Heschel has a quote in the film. It says, "Feel the pain of the other." And what does that mean to you, Congressman? And what does that mean to you, Rabbi? So start with the Congressman.
It is a beautiful quote that speaks to the fact that we have this shared destiny, this linked fate, as I mentioned earlier, where the long-suffering fight for social justice, for equal rights, for equal treatment, for dignity, is one that we are only able to achieve when we put ourselves in the shoes of other people, people who may not share all of our lived experiences, but who likewise are human beings, people who love, who have dreams, who are individuals who have uniquenesses that are beautiful and are part of this diversity that we celebrate in the United States of America, for example. But if we allow ourselves to be divided, particularly by the same people who want to defeat all of us, then we will not come together as our history shows we can successfully to make a more perfect union, to bend that arc of the moral universe towards justice in the way that the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. told us to do.
Rabbi, I wanted to mention this week I've spent a lot of time watching the testimony of the witnesses to the experience of George Floyd with the policeman who had his knee in his neck for almost 9 minutes. And what brought me to tears was listening to the 9-year-old boy, seeing the young man who blames himself now because he saw a $20 bill and thought it was, a fraud. And the woman who was off duty and was she was a paramedic and stopped and begged and tried to help him. That to me was sharing the pain of others. We all have family who we know within the Jewish community who had severe losses during the Holocaust. But many of us have had no experience with the Black community and the collective history of slavery and lynching. And I must say that I spent several days in a deep funk saying, I don't know, it's going on now, every minute of the day across the United States. A good friend of mine, I've been a advocate for kids on the spectrum, and she used to tell me she didn't want her kid driving a car and being arrested for driving while Black. And now I can understand. I'm feeling the pain of others after watching all of this. You can read about it. You can see films about it. but in real time, we're experiencing both a pandemic of health and a pandemic of hate. So you want to understand that it's really changing us. And this film that our documentary that is so magnificent should really be used educating every group we can possibly get, and action steps need to be taken. I mean, there's Rabbi Isaiah, do you want to weigh in on this, because you have a very unique experience? And Rabbi, before you answer that question, I want to thank Congressman Jones, who has to leave us now, for his time and great contributions to this discussion.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Dr. Rogers, what a beautiful film. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Please.
I'm gonna call Dr. Jones and let him know that I was with you tonight. He will be.
I was just going to say, I was a lowly researcher on that, but please, but I did call him during my campaign, so he should have some familiarity with me recently. All right, take care.
Congressman Jones,
Congratulations.
thank you so much.
Thank you
And
so much.
this should just be the beginning of our conversations with our JCC and our full communities in Rockland County.
Those conversations. Thank you.
Be well. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Pleasure, Congressman.
Rabbi, go ahead with your weighing in on this.
Yes, the creation of Adam and Eve, they were created equal together. Zachar unekeva bara otam. They were created together, and the rabbis asked this question: Mipnei ma nivra Adam yachid? Why were Adam and Eve created by themselves? Why didn't the story start somewhere else? Why did the Torah start by showing the first humans? And so it's to say that this is about all of us, that so that you don't say my ancestors are greater than your ancestors, my ancestors are worse than your ancestors, right? And this, therefore, we're saying this is about all of us, you know. And so Mickey, you know, the headlines and seeing what's happening in the world today, and you know, the work, Dr. Rogers, that you've done around civil rights, we know it's human rights. It's about us as people. It's about the dignity of humanity. It's about the spark, that spark of infinity. And so, you know, in terms of like the labels and the constructs and the things that divide us, I think so powerful, and that what you capture, and so powerful that we see that our ancestors have done in the past, is that despite the pain, despite the division, being able to come together, stand for the sake of human rights and human dignity above all else. I think like that's what gives me hope for the 21st century. And the youth, really, the youth, they see it, and they it's amazing. The prophecy, you know, the prophecy from Isaiah, Nar katan noheg bam, that the children will lead the way. It's kind of wild. It's kind of wild. And I think, you know, Dr. King knew that too. We know with those different children's, you know, marches that took place throughout the civil rights era. And we know that also John Lewis. And so there's a lot there. But I just would want to close by, at least on this question, Mickey, is that when I look at the headlines, what I feel immediately, regardless of what the social, cultural, or racial identities that are a factor or variables, this is about all of us. This is, we literally, we all come from Adam and Eve, you know, we're in this together.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I wanted to ask Dr. Rogers, are there any other things that we haven't been able to cover that you would like to leave us with? And Rabbi, is there anything else you would like to say? So Dr. Rogers, let me have you go first. Or no, Rabbi, let me have you go first, because you just said quite a lot. But there might be one final send off, because we're about to close our panel. And then Dr. Rogers, you can wrap it up.
You know, I think I'll just pick up with something that the Congressman shared before. You know, this work is on a generational timeline. Every generation has its own responsibilities and its own voices, its own approaches. And I would just want us to hold that as we engage in the 21st century, this decade, this revolution of love, of equity, that, you know, Zed Dor Dor Shav, each generation has its own kind of seekers. Each generation has its own kinds of revolutionaries. And I hope that we can see ourselves in that. I hope that each of us, that it's not just for the select few, but that each of us could put on our shoes, you know? Each of us could stand together.
Dr. Rogers said I should ask you if you'd like to sing us out at the end, but let's see if she has anything else to, you might have a song you'd like to sing for us and close this off like they did in Washington with Peter Yarrow. So
I
Dr.
always
Rogers,
think thank you so much, Mickey. This was short, but very profound. So you did an amazing job of organizing and pulling this together. But these panelists are just extraordinary. And I know music inspired the civil rights movement. And I think the music is the pen to the soul. And that's why I think if we are going to be talking about civil rights movement, I think music is very profound because it was almost like the cheerleader of the people when they were in so much pain and they needed that music to inspire them. So I'm so grateful. And I just have to say one last thing. Rabbi Hirsch, who was 96 years old, he's the founder of the Religious Action Center, and he had given a little sermon in Selma that Dr. King introduced him. And it was amazing how much of what he said then, and even the sermon he gave when Dr. King was after he was murdered to 2,000 Jewish people. It was right before Passover. It's still relevant today. So I think there's a lot to learn from our history, and I think we need to keep each of our histories close to our heart and learn about them. And I think to open up our hearts, we need music. So Rabbi, your sound. Rabbi, your sound. There you go.
Oh, Dr. Rogers. Yes, we need music. And to keep it close to our heart, like you said, there's one song, Freedom Song. I'm so curious actually what songs like in your research that really grabbed onto you, but one that, to keep something at the forefront of your mind, waking up in the morning and to wake up with our mind on freedom. So that's a song that I'm just thinking of, especially as we leave Passover and march towards Freedom Land. And as we remember that Dr. King says that freedom without law is not freedom, we march towards Sinai to receive the Torah. And so I think of the song that woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Yeah, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Yeah, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Yeah, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Yeah, I woke up this morning with my mind. It's kind of like the Moda Ani. You wake up in the morning and the first words you say are, I'm grateful. Like that's the lens that's a bold way to wake up, right? To be grateful when you wake up, it's a blessing. And to say that I wake up with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. That's one that I really love.
thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Ironically enough, when Dr. Jones came to Selma, the 50th anniversary from Selma to Montgomery March, that is the song that he started singing in the Temple Mishkan. Yes. Yeah, so it's a perfect way to
really
sort of circle this whole thing.
Thank you so much.